Hello everyone, it's Old Guardian here. Dr. Boom's incredible Inventions, the miniset has been here for a little bit under a week, but the meta is still really searching for itself. There are lots of decks being played on the ladder right now, so there's a lot of diversity. However, many of these decks are just barely above that 50% win rate line, so they're just barely hanging on, and as people start to gravitate towards the more successful decks, then the probability to keep climbing with those decks is going smaller and smaller. But we'll see what happens with that. Also, there's a lot of Highlander decks. This is still a result of the big patch, which nerfed the plagues, so Highlander cards can no longer be countered, and indeed, I'm going to feature 17 decks actually in this video, and 5 of those decks are going to be Highlander decks. Overall, the meta is dominated by 2 decks. There's Flood Paladin and there's Pain Warlock. So if you want to climb fast, you will just choose one of those 2. There's no deck that counters both of them, and they are just really strong decks. But if you're satisfied with a somewhat slower climbing pace, then right now there are lots of decks that you can play and you can win enough to climb even if at a slower pace. And if there should be some kind of balance patch that would hit Paladin and Warlock, then things would be wide open because there would be quite a few candidates. So maybe some of the decks that I'm featuring here now can be useful after any potential nerfs are going to come. So let's take a look at the top Hearthstone decks after the miniset. And coming in at number 17 we have Highlander Shaman. Highlander Shaman got one new card from the miniset with Murloc Growth-in, a pretty nice addition, but I mean it's still just a 1-drop. And Highlander Shaman has this mixed matchup spread right now where it's strongest a couple of popular decks, Flood Paladin being the prime one, and then Secret Hunter, but it's also with many weaknesses, Highlander Warrior, Handbuff Paladin, Pain Warlock. So when you look at the popular decks, Highlander Shaman has fewer upsides than downsides, but it still has some good matchups, which means that it's able to slowly climb the ladder. At number 16 there's Miracle Rogue, or Playhouse Rogue or Giant Rogue, whatever you want to call it. The rogue deck that plays Playhouse Giants and then makes many Playhouse Giants and boom, suddenly there's a board of Playhouse Giants and pow. Or sometimes it's just a 0 cost everything must go and wihee, lots of stuff coming up. Miracle Rogue also got something from the miniset with the Dubious Purchase, so a bit of an addition but nothing too major. And it's another one of these decks that are currently hanging on at this around 50% win rate. At number 15 we have Hybrid Druid with its hero power shenanigans. It has some strengths and some weaknesses. It doesn't really have major strengths or weaknesses against the top tier meta decks, which might make it an interesting deck to climb with, because you're not super favored or super unfavored against the most common candidates on the ladder, but overall you're still slightly unfavored against them, so Hybrid Druid, capable of climbing, but not very fast. Despite the nerf to Zarimi Priest is still around and it still has some strengths, but actually Zarimi Priest is no longer the best Priest deck, because Priest can play control again. Miniset gave a couple of new tools for these control style Priest decks. There's the Funhouse Mirror and there's the Puppet Theater, and when you play control right now, well, you want to play in Highlander shell, because yeah, you get Reno Lone Ranger with that. So Highlander Priest actually looks somewhat capable at the moment. I'm still a little bit uncertain where this is going to land exactly, and it's only slightly above 50% right now. But if you have been a Priest main and you've been waiting, hey, I want to play like Priest style gameplay, you know, making use of the opponent's resources against them, frustrating them with healing and with just outlasting their threats, Highlander Priest just could be the deck for you, and now thanks to the miniset, it seems playable again. One deck that I'm quite excited about is Handbuff Death Knight. Death Knight overall is doing really poorly. Plague Death Knight, well, Plagues got nerfed. Then Rainbow Death Knight. Rainbow Death Knight is somewhat playable, but Rainbow Death Knight lost much of its ways to answer to early aggression. But Handbuff Death Knight, now with the Toy Snatching Geist included, is the newcomer in Death Knights. The sample size are really small, that's why the strong against weak against is so vague, because there just aren't that many games played. But I like the results that I see so far. I think Handbuff Death Knight has potential to be ranked much higher, but I want to be a little bit conservative with my evaluations when the data is quite low. Anyway, if you're looking for something new to play, if you really want to play with Death Knight, something maybe a little bit experimental so the results are not quite as guaranteed, Handbuff Death Knight could be the thing. Spellmage has been super popular since the miniset. Spellmage, well, it was buffed and then now it got malfunction out of the miniset. So Blizzard has really tried to give Spellmage more and more tools, but it's still far more popular than its performance warrants. Spellmage finally has breached the 50% barrier. It's quite certainly above 50% because there's so many games played with Spellmage and it's just steadily at around 52% or so. So yes, this deck is now finally playable. No, it's nowhere near as good as the number of people that playing it would imply, but it does have some nice matchups, like because the matchup against Pain Warlock is quite okay, and that is an asset in the current meta. So if you have wanted to play Spellmage, then thanks to all the buffs, it's finally viable, which it really wasn't at the start of Whizbang. There is also a new Druid archetype on the ladder with Treant Druid. The addition of Overgrown Beanstalk from the miniset has made Treant Druid a viable deck again. And yeah, its biggest problem is that it's weak against Flood Paladin and it's weak against Pain Warlock. And those are the two most dominant decks. So with Treant Druid, the real hope for Treant Druid lies in a potential balance patch, because those two are the top decks at the moment. If both of them get nerfed, then that might mean really good things for Treant Druid, because they are its main weaknesses. But we'll see how it goes. Anyway, you can already jam some Treants on the ladder and really keep an eye on potential balance patches. There are currently 3 Warlock decks that you can consider bringing to the ladder. There's Sludge Warlock, which I actually don't feature in this list because Sludge seems to be a little bit down at the moment. Then there's Insanity Warlock, which has largely replaced Sludge Warlock. That replacement already started slightly before the miniset. After the big balance patch, Insanity Warlock just started to become more popular and become better. And then there's the Pain Warlock. Pain Warlock was great earlier, then it became weaker, and now, thanks to the miniset, it's great again. So, at the moment, if you want to play Warlock, there's very little reason to play anything else than Pain Warlock. But Insanity Warlock is still a fairly decent deck, and even Sludge Warlock is potentially playable. Like, if you still happen to have that Sludge Warlock from the release of Whizbang, then yeah, you can bring that to the ladder, just don't expect to climb very quickly. Paladin is doing great on the ladder at the moment. There's 3 viable Paladin archetypes, and Highlander Paladin, which is the 8th best deck overall, is the weakest Paladin archetype behind Handbuff and Flood Paladin. Highlander Paladin took a couple of cards from the miniset. There's Whack-a-Mole, there's Holy Glow Sticks. Just, well, that's the way you build Highlander decks. They are value piles of good stuff, and typically whenever there's a new expansion, whenever there's a new miniset, new cards get added, Highlander deck picks up 1 or 2 of those and just adds them to their ever-growing strength. And Highlander Paladin is doing fine, but it starts to look like it's falling behind the other Paladin archetypes, so this would be the least recommendable Paladin deck. After the big balance patch, the Shopper Demon Hunter with Window Shopper and Umpire's Grasp was able to return back to the meta. Demon Hunter was nerfed earlier, and then it became really weak, and then the other balance changes happened later, and then that made Demon Hunter again viable deck because everyone else got a little bit weaker. Now the miniset has arrived, and miniset has changed the balance of power within Demon Hunter a little bit, because it has made the Naga Shopper Demon Hunter variant the slightly stronger one. You can also still play the regular, more aggro Shopper Demon Hunter, but the Naga variant, with now the addition of Sock Puppet Slither Spear, is currently performing a little bit better and is actually a fairly good deck, although this meta is quite dominated by just a couple of top decks. And right behind those top decks we have Hunter with its new miniset legendary card Product 9. So Product 9 has brought secrets back into play with Hunter, and you can play Secret Hunter in 2 variants. You can play it like this, fairly aggressive, running duplicates, or you can play it as a Highlander list. And actually it looks like the Highlander list is the slightly stronger one. Highlander Hunter is obviously slower, but Highlander Hunter has access to Teldurin the Lost, which is the highest performing card in the deck, and Teldurin the Lost just swings you right back into the game. And also you have some of that great late game power with Kinglebash and of course with Reno Lone Ranger. So Highlander Hunter doing quite well. would still want to see a little bit more data about Highlander Hunter, and I'm a little bit unclear about its exact matchup spread so far. But overall, looking at its performance on the ladder, I believe that it is currently the stronger one compared to the duplicates running Secret Hunter. And now we take another step forward, another level of performance. Basically, the decks number 4 and 3 are on a level of their own, and then there's the top 2 that are even a level above them. And at number 4 we have Highlander Warrior. Yeah, Deep Miner Bran costs 8. Highlander Warrior does not mind. It's crazy how versatile, durable, and lethal in the late game this deck just continues to be. Just a wonderful deck, even after all the nerfs. But if you look for the dominant class in the current meta, look no further than Paladin. I mean, sure, there's Pain Warlock out there, but Paladin just has so many archetypes, with Highlander being quite viable, Handbuff Paladin being very, very strong, only weaker than the top 2 decks. Just, hey, it's time to make those big minis again, it's time to make that big Leroy again, and time to hit face for a lot of damage in a single go. But it's clear that the fight for the top spot, there's only 2 candidates, there's Flood Paladin and there's Pain Warlock. And I have arranged them so that Flood Paladin is number 2 and Pain Warlock is number 1. That was a tough decision. Overall, I think it's this way because Flood Paladin has slightly more weaknesses, because there's multiple Highlander decks that can beat Flood Paladin, Highlander Warrior, then also Highlander Shaman. So I think Flood Paladin is slightly more vulnerable. And also Flood Paladin is slightly less dominant in many of its good matchups. So Pain Warlock just edges out ahead. Even though, when it comes to the mirror, it's actually Flood Paladin that beats Pain Warlock. But Flood Paladin is Pain Warlock's only weakness. That's literally the only deck that's a good challenger to Pain Warlock. Otherwise, Pain Warlock is just super dominant. Like any Highlander deck, Pain Warlock is just incredibly, incredibly strong. Pain Warlock got such great tools from the mini set with mass production. Yeah, mass production, wild. Ooh, well, we don't get into Demon Seed, this is a standard video. But mass production and then Infernal. Just ways to deal damage to yourself even more, ways to get all of that good stuff out there, and then ways to heal yourself back up to 15 while developing a big taunt minion. Pain Warlock right now, it just has it all. It's phenomenal deck with only one weakness, being Flood Paladin. So I think Pain Warlock deserves the place at number 1, even though it loses against the number 2. So that's the early mini-set metagame. I expect, of course, balance changes. Blizzard has this balance patch window between 9 and 14 days of mini-set release typically, so it can still come this week or then early next week, one or the other. And these are obviously the main candidates to be nerfed, but we'll see how it goes. Right now, if you want to climb the ladder, depending on what you see, Pain Warlock or Flood Paladin are your top choices. If you're satisfied with somewhat slower pace, then you actually have a whole bunch of choices, of which in this video I have presented 17 different decks. Thank you for watching. Click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and a special thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, YouTube members and Twitch subscribers who make all of these videos possible.